Imagine two scenes unfolding at the same time. In the first, an Ohio suburb on an autumn morning. Wide streets, identical lawns, and two-story homes painted white, pastel blue, or charcoal gray, with pitched asphalt shingle roofs and vinyl siding across their facades. Rap your knuckles against one of those walls, and you will hear a dry, hollow sound, almost like tapping on the body of a guitar. Now, change the picture. A narrow street in Cologne, Germany, or Bruges, Belgium. Terraced houses, 3 stories tall, with exposed brick facades and mortar joints that have endured a century and a half of snow. Knock on a wall here, and it answers with a dense mineral sound, almost silent. The first home was probably built in 4 months. The second may have been standing since before the unification of Italy. Yet both were built for the same purpose, to shelter a middle-class family through a cold winter. How did two radically different solutions emerge for the same problem? The quick answer, the one that appears in almost every online discussion, is that the United States has plenty of timber, while Europe does not. That answer is correct, but it is so incomplete that it becomes misleading. If timber abundance alone determined how homes were built, Russia would have pine skyscrapers, and Canada would have eliminated concrete from its vocabulary. The truth is that timber became the dominant material in American home building only because of a remarkably specific combination of forests, industrial technology, scarce labor, rapid migration, and a climate more forgiving than it first appears. Remove any one of those pieces, and the entire puzzle falls apart. That is why each piece deserves to be examined carefully. Beginning on the other side of the Atlantic, where the story starts much earlier. When the first English settlers landed at Jamestown in 1607, the Europe they had left behind was already, to a considerable extent, a deforested landscape. England had spent centuries felling oak trees to build ships and cathedral beams, produce charcoal for iron smelting, and clear land for pasture. By around 1500, demand for timber had already created noticeable shortages across much of Western Europe, and the problem intensified as the Industrial Revolution accelerated the consumption of fuel and building materials. In densely populated cities such as London, Paris, and Amsterdam, the nearby forests simply no longer existed. Timber had to be imported from the Baltic, increasing the cost of any project that depended on it. Then there was the terror of urban fire. The Great Fire of London in 1666 destroyed roughly 13,000 homes in 4 days, nearly all of them timber-framed structures with clay and straw infill. Parliament responded by requiring reconstruction in brick and stone. From that point onward, the logic became self-reinforcing. The more building codes demanded masonry, the more the market specialized in masonry. The more efficiently bricks could be produced, the scarcer skilled labor became for heavy timber framing. Europe's brick buildings are not merely an aesthetic choice. They are the accumulated consequence of 5 centuries of shrinking forests and memories of fire. Then there is the climate. The moisture of northwestern Europe, with its long winters and persistent rainfall, is unforgiving to timber structures that do not receive constant maintenance. Stone and brick not only withstand moisture more effectively, but also provide thermal mass that makes sense in a climate where temperatures fluctuate less dramatically, and the difference between winter and summer can be managed with thick walls. A 12-inch solid brick wall moderates changes in outdoor temperature in a way that a wall made from plywood, rigid foam, and drywall never could. It acts like a small thermal reservoir, creating conditions reminiscent of the interior of a cave. It is no coincidence that European vernacular architecture crystallized around this behavior. It emerged in response to a landscape that no longer had enough trees, a past that had already burned too many times, and a climate in which wall thickness meant comfort rather than waste. Now, cross the ocean. When those same English settlers reached the northeastern coast of what would become New England, they encountered something Europe had not seen for centuries. An almost unbroken forest stretching from the Atlantic deep into the continent. Even conservative estimates suggest that roughly 1 billion acres of native forest once covered the territory of what is now the contiguous United States, much of it composed of fast-growing conifers, pines, spruces, cedars, and the celebrated Douglas fir of the Pacific Northwest. These were softwood species, easy to saw, quick to dry, and capable of producing straight lengths of lumber with relatively few knots. Even today, forests cover roughly 1/3 of the United States, and more than 2/3 of the commercially available timber volume is softwood, the same category used almost exclusively for structural framing. Look at modern production figures and the scale becomes clear. Oregon alone produced approximately 5.1 billion board feet of lumber in 2024, representing about 14% of total American output. That is a quantity Europe as a whole could not match without imports. But abundant forests alone do not explain the American home. The earliest settlers actually tried to reproduce the architecture they already knew. The colonial homes of 17th-century New England used heavy timber framing, with oak beams, mortise and tenon joints, wooden pegs, and wall sections assembled on the ground before being raised by crews of 20 men. It was imported architecture, expensive, slow, and dependent on highly skilled carpenters. It worked while the frontier remained small. It began to fail dramatically when the frontier moved westward. From that moment, the story changed continents and became distinctly American. The turning point came in Chicago during the autumn of 1832. A merchant and civil engineer named George Washington Snow had arrived in July of that year, when the settlement still had a population of roughly 250. Along the Chicago River, he erected a warehouse to store goods arriving aboard ships from the Great Lakes. He had neither the time nor the carpenters required to build it using traditional methods. Snow replaced heavy, interlocking beams with a framework of slender, machine-sawn lumber, positioned vertically every 12 to 16 inches and fastened with inexpensive machine-made nails that had only recently entered mass production in the United States. This was balloon framing. According to the popular story, the name came from veteran carpenters who saw the method in 1833, when Augustine Taylor used it to build St. Mary's Church in Chicago, and declared that the framework was so flimsy that the next strong wind would carry it away like a balloon. They were wrong. What they dismissed as a balloon would define a century and a half of American home building. What Snow had realized, almost by accident, was that the combination of three elements would transform architecture forever. First came standardized dimensional lumber, the familiar 2x4 boards that any steam-powered sawmill could mass produce. Second came machine-made nails, whose price fell dramatically beginning in the 1830s because they could be cut and forged mechanically instead of hammered individually by blacksmiths. Third came semi-skilled labor. A farmer in Kansas no longer needed 20 years of carpentry experience to build his home. He only needed to know how to nail one piece of lumber to another. The technology democratized the act of building. A home that once required 20 men, 3 months, and a master carpenter could now be completed by 4 men in 3 weeks, with the help of an illustrated manual. Factories in Chicago began manufacturing pre-cut kits for entire homes, packing them onto trains and shipping them to the treeless prairies of Nebraska and the Dakotas. It was architecture by catalog, half a century before Sears began selling mail-order houses. And this is where another factor enters the story, one that many people overlook. The United States not only had abundant forests, it had a population that moved constantly. The 19th century American was the European who had decided that remaining in one place for 3 generations was a sentence, not a virtue. The frontier pushed the population westward in successive waves. New railroads created new towns from nothing. A home designed to last 200 years, like a Flemish brick house, made little economic sense for a family that would probably move away within a decade. A timber-framed home assembled in 3 weeks made financial sense precisely because expectations of permanence were low. That logic survives today. The average American moves approximately 11 times over a lifetime, roughly twice the Western European average. The home is treated as a semi-disposable asset, a vehicle with a deed, something to buy, repaint, sell, and replace. Brick demands permanence. Timber accommodates movement. One final piece remains, and it is the least obvious: climate. Conventional wisdom suggests that timber homes are fragile and brick homes are solid. But the way these materials respond to different forms of stress is far more nuanced than it seems. In the United States, the primary climatic threat is not Europe's cold moisture. It is extreme variation. A home in Minneapolis may experience temperatures below 5 degrees Fahrenheit in January and above 95 in July. Because timber framing is lightweight and flexible, it accommodates thermal expansion and contraction more effectively than masonry, which is more likely to crack under extreme temperature cycles. Furthermore, a significant portion of the United States lies within major seismic zones, particularly California, where an unreinforced solid brick wall performs extremely poorly during an earthquake. Timber flexes and returns. Brick cracks and collapses. It is no coincidence that the only part of the United States where masonry holds a significant share of the residential market is Florida and the wider South, where hurricanes require heavier structural systems for entirely different reasons. Current statistics from the National Association of Home Builders show that, in 2024, 94% of all single-family homes constructed in the United States used wood framing. Only 5% used concrete, and less than 0.5% used steel. Of those concrete homes, the overwhelming majority were built in the South, where wind and moisture justify the additional cost. It was at the meeting point between these two worlds that some of the most fascinating episodes began to unfold. Moments when an architectural solution traveled into a context where it made little sense, producing a small disaster in slow motion. German and Scandinavian immigrants arriving in the Midwest during the late 19th century often attempted to reproduce their traditional brick homes. Many of these buildings still stand in the historic towns of Wisconsin and Minnesota, and they are notorious for being exceptionally cold during winter. European brickwork performed well through winters, hovering around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but it cracked when temperatures remained below zero for weeks at a time. In the opposite direction, wealthy Americans of the late 19th century attempted to export balloon framing to tropical colonies, to the Philippines, Hawaii, and parts of the Caribbean, only to discover that subterranean termites and equatorial humidity could destroy pine framing within approximately a decade. The Second World War later helped export the American model to Japan during the occupation. Even today, entire neighborhoods in Tokyo contain American-style timber-framed homes, shaped by that influence, although they have been adapted with far more rigorous seismic engineering. When architecture travels, it must be translated. When it is not, it rots, cracks, or burns. Now we arrive in the present, where the once clear division between these two models is beginning to blur. In the United States, light wood frame construction remains dominant for single-family homes, but the concept itself is becoming more sophisticated and moving closer to Europe. One of the most closely watched technologies in contemporary American construction is mass timber, engineered wood assembled into massive structural panels, including cross-laminated timber, commonly known as CLT. It is timber, but structurally, it can perform much like concrete. 18-story residential towers using CLT have already been built in Milwaukee and Portland, and the technique roughly tripled its share of the American non-residential market between 2019 and 2023. In Europe, the movement is heading in the opposite direction. Light wood frame construction is gaining ground in countries such as Sweden, Austria, and France, driven both by environmental concerns and by pressure to reduce embodied carbon, which is exceptionally high in brick and concrete construction. Producing 1 ton of brick releases somewhere between 200 and 300 kilograms of carbon dioxide. A ton of timber absorbs carbon as the tree grows and continues to store that carbon for as long as the wood remains inside the wall. From a climate perspective, the American home is suddenly fashionable. And there is a curious fact that almost no one mentions. The United States has more forested land today than it did in 1920. Annual growth in commercially managed forests exceeds harvesting by approximately 40%. The country grows timber faster than it cuts it, particularly in the South, where short-rotation pine plantations harvested every 20 to 30 years provide an increasing share of the raw material. This is not perfect sustainability. Pine monocultures create serious ecological problems. But it is an unusual situation in a world where deforestation remains the norm. Europe, by comparison, has also been recovering forest cover since the middle of the 20th century, but at a much slower pace and still far below its historical levels. The final irony is that the two continents are slowly converging on a middle ground, with Americans discovering masonry in tornado-prone regions and Europeans rediscovering timber in the name of climate action. Walk through a Denver suburb today, and then through an outer neighborhood of Stockholm, and you will still encounter two very different landscapes. Denver's homes will have vinyl siding, asphalt shingle roofs, two-car garages, and an expected service life of roughly 60 to 70 years, provided they are properly maintained. The homes in Stockholm will have painted brick facades, clay tile roofs, and an expectation of permanence that can easily exceed a century. But look more closely, and you will notice that the newest Swedish homes have internal timber framing, while Denver's latest mid-rise developments, those 5-story buildings rising across its revitalized urban districts, are being constructed with CLT panels supplied by sawmills in Oregon. The wall separating these two worlds has grown thinner. Architecture is ultimately the most tangible record a society leaves of its relationship with the land, raw materials, time, and permanence. When you enter an American home and notice the distinctive smell of fresh lumber, the faint creak of the floor, and the sense that the framework is breathing with the wind outside, you are experiencing 300 years of abundant forests, railroads, immigration, and a decision made in Chicago in 1832 by a man in a hurry who needed somewhere to store his goods before winter arrived. When you lean against a brick wall in Cologne and feel the silent chill of ancient masonry, you are touching 5 centuries of medieval deforestation, urban fires, and accumulated craftsmanship. There is no single correct solution. There are forests, there is climate, there is history, and there are people building shelter with whatever they have at hand. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We will see you in the next video.